Hi everyone, thank you for having me. So, over the last 2 days I think we've seen a lot of what I would call very high level on-stage actors. What is happening in the world and what we can expect in the future and what we've seen in the past. What I'm hoping to do today is to talk a bit about some of the concepts that we've seen throughout these 2 days. Usually people call it disinformation. The popular term is for recent years becoming fake news. I'm using them interchangeably. And today I want to talk about basically, there's two take-home messages. One is that people need to realize a bit more, I guess, that fake news is all around us and that you are not necessarily influenced, but at least presented with it every now and then. And the other thing is that while fake news is often kind of portrayed as something very extreme, so either it's completely true or it's completely falsehoods that are shared to advance a certain notion, I want to talk to you a bit about some more grey areas somewhere in between that tell you when you can combine truth and some fiction and how those stories can influence you as well. My background personally is in psychology, behavioral change, and now cybersecurity, so I'm talking more about individuals and end users compared to the more international relations talks we've had so far. Right, so just have a bit of an idea whether fake news is a problem, yes or no. Related to the US elections, you can see some numbers on the slide. With 83% of the time, respondents who cited FB Facebook as a major news source felt that the fake news headlines they recognized were accurate. So there's stuff about Pope Francis shocking the world by allegedly supporting Donald Trump, while usually he is, of course, very neutral in these things and would not endorse any presidential candidate at all, in case you'd have to work with them later on, with the opposing candidate later on if someone doesn't win. And while fake news is a kind of a recent topic in the last couple of years, before that, of course, and that's been iterated many times during these couple of days, we had all kinds of events that we call propaganda or any kind of disinformation or other ways of influencing people. So to come up with a few examples of what nowadays you would say before fake news, but what actually was kind of similar. I've got this slide for you. So in the top you've got the Iranian guard trying to launch their missiles, and on the left you see the picture that actually shows what happened. So 3 missiles were launched and the 4th one, something went wrong. And of course that's not a very great sign if you want to show off your firepower, right? If you want to show this is what we can do, you don't want one failing missile in there. So they used some Photoshop to change a bit of what was happening. Very subtly, so most of the image is correct and actually representing what happened all along, but they do make some changes to make it a bit more enticing. Down left corner, the only reason people found out is because 2 outlets used the exact same mugshot of O.J. Simpson, but what you can see is that either Newsweek lightened up his skin color a bit, or Time darkened it a bit, or possibly both at the same time, just to fit the narrative they were going for in their news articles, right? And in the right bottom corner that you can't probably see very well, the idea is that this guy stood on the World Trade Center at 9/11 when the plane flew in his tower. This image is completely fake in the sense that you can quite easily imagine someone being at that observatory deck when this happened, but this guy was there on a completely different date, and they changed the date in the bottom corner, they added the plane in just for some kind of dramatic effect. And more recently, when we start talking about fake news, you get to these kind of headlines. Election meddling, investigators exploring whether Russia colluded with Trump. Facebook under pressure, and especially in the last couple of months, even more under pressure to tackle fake news through some campaigns. We'll talk a bit more about how social media is making fake news actually worse in a bit. But it does show that we are more and more likely to hear something about fake news and be presented with fake news while we are conducting a day-to-day business, while we are chatting with friends on Facebook, while we are reading our Twitter timelines, whether it's Russian trolls, whether it's any kind of other group of people who wants to advance a certain political agenda or wants to get people discussing a topic that they haven't been discussing before, or to take a slightly different view than they usually have. So take a look at some of the online growth. So generally, approximately half in the US, and slightly less, but still quite a lot in the UK, report using social media as a source of news. The issue with this is that on social media it's much easier to share fake news and disinformation because you can create your own website quite easily, your own blog or your own kind of outlet that you can then share online, compared to printed media, for example, which has a lot higher investment, or even TV programs, of course, that not everyone can just as easily create. So when people then say social media is becoming a news source for me, and I actually take my news from social media, the question becomes, do they also check sources? My guess is they don't, and so you only look at headlines. You might click and then actually read the article, but the actual challenge of assessing whether the source is a true source and a useful source and a reliable source is something that they barely do. And of course, bots, as we've heard the two journalists talk about yesterday, are a big issue as well. And so you got these kind of blog posts where people say, right, Russian bots flood Twitter after parking shooting program, wanting to create some hostilities within society, trying to get people polarized, people working against each other, sparking a debate that perhaps, especially in the first day after such a dramatic event, is maybe not the right moment to have these debates, but they want to basically create more panic and create more chaos. And they do that quite effectively, I think. So far, basically what we see with fake news is that people talk about a very black and white view. Either something is completely true or something is completely false. What I want to do next is talk you through different types of disinformation or fake news, which go from very low intent to deceive to very high intent to deceive. So first I'll talk you through them, then I'll show you some examples to give you a bit of an idea how that works. So at the bottom end we got satire and parody, right? So we've got a lot of websites just putting out nonsense just for a laugh. There's nothing really wrong with this, but technically it's fake news because it is not stating the truth, and people might actually sometimes fall for it, even though if they would read the whole article, they should at some point realize that something is wrong. And as you see at the top and at the other side, we've got fabricated content, which is what people usually call fake news. So the second one, we got false connection, where headlines, visuals, or captions don't support the content. People on social media will recognize this usually as clickbait, where you think, hold on, this headline doesn't really seem to make sense. And you either ignore it or maybe you actually click it to read on, and then you usually will find out that something isn't really right. But here already the intent to deceive is a bit high, so people might actually not realize something is going wrong. They get misleading content, misleading use of information to frame an individual or an issue, which is more about which information do you use, which do you not use, etc., etc. A false context, where genuine content is shared with false contextual information. Imposter content, when genuine sources are impersonated. So you see this quite easily on social media, is that, for example, you can create your own news website that looks a lot like a trustworthy news website with a completely different URL, but that still would be a sensible URL to choose. And suddenly people will not necessarily check the source, or even if they click on the source, they will just see a whole website with news that just incorporates this fake news article as well. A get manipulated content, when genuine information or imagery is manipulated to deceive, and then you end up with kind of full fake news as people know it, completely fabricated, nothing is true, nothing makes sense at all, but people are just using it to advance their own agenda. Right, so let's take a look at a couple of simple examples. When you read stuff like this, you usually are quite aware this is for fun, right? It's a play on the thing where people see Jesus in a toasty or whatever, and it's just basically pointing out something fun. Almost every country has their own website doing this. You might be deceived by it if you don't know what that nation's website is. So people in Europe might not necessarily know The Onion, for example. People from other non-European countries might not know Private Eye. In Dutch we have De Speld that does this kind of stuff. Usually you're okay here, but still if you scroll past it quite quickly you might actually not realize that's completely nonsense. Then we get Bill Clinton apparently being endorsed by a space alien. So what you see here is, Bill Clinton either at some kind of theme party with someone dressed up as an alien, or it's some movie prop or something, and he thinks it's funny to shake his hand. And suddenly, by using a headline, you kind of are falsely creating a connection between the rest of the article or a picture and the actual headline that people will remember. So again, usually when you actually click through and you actually read the whole article, you'll find out something is not really right. But with social media, when you scroll through a timeline, you might just see the headline not click, and still the headline is something you realize, so you remember over time, and it might have some effect. Then we get to the slightly nastier ones. So this is a black man with some food in his hand, some stuff I think he tried to save after Hurricane Katrina. I've got two different news outlets, and one news outlet writes about this, saying a young man walks through chest-deep flood water after looting a grocery store in New Orleans. Then, rather than a black guy, I've got some white people. And here it says, 2 residents wade through chest-deep water after finding bread and soda, right? So somebody is not looting anymore of some kind of grocery store, but they just happen to find some food, and of course you take it because, you know, it's panic, it's disaster, it's chaos. And you can see here quite easily how it's how you can use this kind of stuff to advance a certain feeling, or advance a certain way in which we talk about people, a way how we discuss certain issues, or how we start feeling about what people have done, right? And it's quite easy to see how finding is much more of a, yeah, of course, yes, I would do that, but looting is something that other people do, that savages do. And so, in a quite simple way, you can start pushing the narrative in a direction while you're not really doing a whole fake news thing, because yes, they did do the behavior, but how you then label it and how you explain it is quite different. Tiny bit worse, we get to false context. So this is a Twitter user, a troll, who says, Muslim woman pays no mind to the terror attack. So this was in London, there was some terror attacks near Westminster. And you can see her just as if she's just idly walking by, not caring at all that someone's on the ground, and at least not doing very well. And then making it a bit about in-group, out-group stuff, where you say them and us. You know, that makes it always quite enticing to spark up fear, and it's about we, of course, help, and we are the good people, and they don't care. Then some journalist actually found this woman, and what happened is she saw what happened, she helped, and then when she couldn't really help anymore because there were all kinds of other people going on, she actually said, right, I'm going to call my parents to tell them I'm okay, because they know I always walk across this part of London, and you know, they might be worried. Which is quite a sensible, normal thing to do, and yet, by just picking the image a bit differently, by creating a false context, you can quite easily put it into a narrative of negativity and some kind of hate building towards specific groups of people. So when we get to imposter content, on the left you've got the authentic BBC website, and on the right you've got a completely fake website. Now, for people in the back who might not be able to read it, so left is bbc.co.uk/news, and the right one is bbcnews.co.uk. Right? You can just, anyone can just get that domain name, create their own website, create posts on there, and if you then share those posts on social media, it will just say, you know, whatever the headline is with a thumbnail, and then you can, down below it might say BBC News co.uk, but most people won't even know what the actual BBC website is, right? So it's quite easy for people to create this website, even if you would then click, well, it even looks like a news website. Yes, there are some differences, but for people who are not even aware of what the authentic website looks like, it's quite easy to change people's perceptions this way. Second to last one, so this is basically when you start manipulating content, and it's more easy to see that there's deception going on if you know what's happening, because they are basically misquoting people or adding posts that weren't said, misstating things. So I think Macron did do some kind of press conference, probably where he said we need to help people if necessary. We hope to do it in the region, but if there's no other way, we will, of course, let some refugees in, which is then translated into vows to flood Europe with millions of African migrants, which is a bit overstating what he was actually doing. And then what people usually recognize as fake news, people might have seen this on their timeline at the time. It was quite a popular one. I think it was quite popular because people who were against Trump were kind of hoping this to be true, that he was just gaming the system, having a bit of fun, and might not actually go through with all his ideas. So he didn't do, I don't think he even did an interview in People's Magazine in '98. The quote is something he didn't say, and the picture they just got from somewhere else, thinking if we just get a picture from somewhere in the 80s or 90s, it looks old enough so it seems to be legitimate in a sense, and we can actually pull this together and create this fake news story. So far I know that everyone has always been talking here and then you guys have interaction afterwards. I want to do one very small example with you guys now that you've seen this. If you already know this one, please don't spoil it for the rest, but this is Legend. It's a UK film made about the Craig brothers, two gangsters in the 60s. So it's a simple film poster, and here's deception. There's some deception in here as well. Anyone, any idea what that could be?
What's that? Is it Berlusconi?
No, all right. No, this is from Hardy in a double role. So both of, because they were twins, he is playing both roles. There's nothing there. No, you see, the thing is that, especially with films, what people always do is, of course, add the 4 or 5 star reviews, right? You don't want to tell people your film was crap, so any crap review is not included in the poster. However, here, they did. The Guardian only gave 2 stars. And they put him nicely between his hands. So it seems that, well, it was such a so many rating reviews, of course they had to somewhere fit the heads in, so you just imagine it was a 4-star review because 2 stars were behind the heads, right? But it's not the case. Actually, the guy didn't really like the film, gave it a 2-star review, and they thought, well, for us it's good if we get the Guardian on here, because people are usually looking at what the Guardian does, and if the Guardian approves of the film, great, then we can put it on our poster. So they were probably gutted they didn't get a 4 or 5-star review and then solved it this way. Now, I don't think people might be overly damaged by this kind of fake news, right? But it just shows that in any kind of media that you are interacting with, the way people present the information to you, they can deceive you, and usually are to some extent. Probably not saying too much new here. So let's take a bit of a look at at how this is going to be a problem more because of technology and because of the way we now interact with news. So one of the biggest problems, I think, on social media is what we call an echo chamber, where you are more likely to talk to people and to interact with people who are like-minded. So if 50 years ago you thought the Earth was flat and you were telling your friends that the Earth is flat, they would laugh at you, you would have another drink, and that would be the end of the story. Nowadays, you go online, you say, I think the Earth is flat, and you always find people somewhere in the globe who think, yeah, I think that makes sense, I agree with you, right? So it's easier to create these groups of people that all start connecting and agreeing with each other, and therefore are becoming less critical of whatever they're talking about, because others who disagree with them are kind of shut out and not included in any kind of discussion or at any kind of event, or just not talked to at all, basically. And the other one, more technical, is a filter bubble, where basically algorithms are looking at what you have seen before, and once they know that you liked something, or you shared something, you commented on it, or you just stopped scrolling for a bit, they will show more of that. You can always try it out for yourself on Facebook. Look up a friend that you haven't seen anything in a timeline for ages, and over the week you will see suddenly a lot of whatever they are doing on there, because they think, well, if you took the hassle of actually looking them up, apparently you suddenly have more interest in what they're doing. And I think it's nicely quoted, nicely cited in this one. It basically says, say you're driving down the road, see a car crash, of course you look, everyone looks. That's normal human behavior. But the internet interprets this behavior as if you want to see it. So what they will do, they show you more car crashes. So for people who are interacting with fake news, if they do it more and more often, that just means that they are going to be presented with fake news more and more often, thereby just kind of power charging those ideas, those concepts, those points of view, because apparently that's what you want to see. And social media has is incentivized by you spending as much time on their site as possible, rather than being neutrally informed or balanced in any opinion. They just want you to spend as much time on there, which is easier if you get to agree with everything they show you. So moving on from this to some more human vulnerabilities. I'm a psychologist after all. So this is the easy one. Truth bias, we tend to think people are telling the truth. So I'm not sure what you've been talking about during lunch, but generally when you ask someone, or they said, oh, I live there, or this is what I do, or this is my name, you just believe them. There's no time, there's no effort, there's no mental capacity to actually second guess everyone all the time. So you all assume, and quite rightly, that my name is Tommy. There's no time, there's no effort, there's no point in trying to check that all the time. And it's the same thing with online news. Many people just read it and kind of believe it just because it's the easiest way of doing things. A bit linked to those echo chambers and filter bubbles is a confirmation bias, where we seek information that confirms existing beliefs. So the more we agree with something, the easier we find it to believe, and the more weight we add to it. It's quite a well-known phenomenon, not just related to fake news, but it is definitely something that gives fake news the trustworthiness it shouldn't get, basically. One of the slightly weird ones is what we call the Dunning-Kruger effect, where people who are very capable underestimate their ability, and vice versa. So people who aren't very capable are basically also not capable of realizing they're not very smart. So they start overestimating their ability. And so what you see a lot, for example, with the vaccination movement is people discussing scientific research without necessarily any background themselves, just by thinking, oh, well, I know what I'm talking about because I've had my personal experience, and my personal experience is always better than systematic research over time, for example. And one of the more long-term effects of fake news and of any kind of disinformation is what we consider a sleeper effect, where even if at first you realize that the source isn't very reliable, there's something dodgy, or you might not know the source very well, over time the information you've got from the source and the source itself start to move away from each other, and it becomes more it becomes more distant where you actually got the information from. And so once it gets far enough apart, the information becomes something separate. And so you don't think about the negatives, the downsides related to it, but you only focus on the information, and it's easier to believe over time, which is not very helpful when you talk about fake news, where you might even at first realize that something is not really going well. So after all these issues, some people are starting to work, of course, on how can we counter these. On individual levels, on getting people to engage with news on a much more depth, in a much more depth than they used to do. I don't have time to discuss all options, and there will hopefully over the years become more new solutions available. But I want to talk you through basically 4 problems and some of their solutions. So this is Stephen Lewandowski and others who basically made a start in how can we conquer the hearts and minds of people and make them focus a bit more on how to reduce fake news impact, basically. So on the left you see 4 problems, and then you got 2 solutions per problem. So one is, they say, there's a continued influence effect, so even if a reputable, respected news source posts something and then retracts it because they found out it was fake news, it's still in people's minds, because the retraction itself leaves this hole that's kind of automatically filled with information again. So what they say, instead of doing that, you should have an alternative account. So you should always explain, no, not only that didn't happen, but this is what really happened. So you always need to kind of replace the existing wrong information with rightful new information, rather than just saying it's wrong information. Another one, repeated retraction, is basically that you keep mentioning that the information was wrong. So you see this with Andrew Wakefield. He wrote a paper that vaccines cause autism in The Lancet, quite a good medical journal. It was then later retracted because it turned out he made some mistakes and it wasn't true. And now whenever you see people talk about this topic, many reputed good news sources will tell you what Andrew Wakefield found and that it was retracted, because it needs to be told again and again. Because there's still people who read the paper and think, oh, what he wrote is right and what he wrote was not disputed at all. Second one, familiarity backfire effect. So the more often you hear a story, the more likely you think it's true. That's why fake news is usually happening over time and repeated. So you need to focus more on facts, but easier said than done, especially if people are still hearing the fake news story alongside it, which you should hopefully try to prevent if possible. And it helps to kind of pre-expose people to anything. So in my research, usually on behavioral change, we can influence people to do all kinds of things. But if we tell them in advance, this is what we're going to try to you and you, it stops working, because people are aware, people are prepared, people know what's coming, and people know that they should probably work against it or try not to be influenced by it. overkill backfire effect. So simple myths are more cognitively attractive than complicated refutations. As people have been saying over these past 2 days, it's much easier to create a fake news story than to explain why it's not the case. Facts always take longer than a lie. You can quite easily just chuck it out there where there's no need for consistency, there's no need for it to link well to other concepts, you just shout it out and it's there. While with facts you have to kind of show how it works. Keeping it simple, foster healthy skepticism, don't make it too complicated. Because even if the truth is complicated, you need to find some way of keeping it almost as simple as the fake news story, because otherwise it just takes too much time for people to actually make a change. I've got a worldview backfire effect. Evidence that threatens worldviews can strengthen initially held beliefs, which is basically a confirmation kind of bias kind of way where we try to only focus on the information we agree with, and if we disagree with certain information, we will find ways of making it fit our worldview by basically digging in even further, even harder. And one of the ways, and I'm kind of seeing the two as one similar one, is what we call self-affirmation. So people are much more open to opposing views or to views they don't necessarily agree with if they find ways of first telling themselves how awesome they are. So if you can tell people, you know you are a critical thinker, but we know you stand for, you're a reasonable person, you enjoy it, when we can talk facts, and all that kind of stuff, people are more likely to then be open to read the refutation and read, well, why some fake news story or some disinformation is not actually true. And to finish, I think we should have a bit of a, while we are kind of trying to catch up with this fake news and trying to fix it, we also should look at what the future holds in terms of fake news, because it would be nice to be ahead of the curve every now and then, rather than to have to chase after how to fix it now in a few years' time. And these are two things you can look up the videos for yourself later. On the left, we've got what's called an AI story generator. So basically what you do, you give it one sentence, so the one without the underlining sentence is what you give him, and then the AI automatically creates a whole story, usually including quotes, anything you want. And while you will see it's not very specific, it is, to the untrained eye, quite realistic and quite convincing. And so while so far fake news already was kind of created by troll factories and other kinds of groups that actually had to put in effort to make it happen, it is now possible to basically, after just a single sentence, let computers take over, thereby creating a much higher productivity rate, basically, for people who want to do harm. I think the people who created this are worried about its impact and have not really released the option for the whole public to use it. The fact that it's there also means that the people who do want to use it should be able to create it themselves. On the right, a YouTube video, I added the title. There's some profanity in it, but if you want to watch it, please do. And it's the idea that you can now, if you've got enough footage of someone and audio recording, you can make them in a video say anything you want. So the guy on the right is actually talking, and in the video it seems as if Obama is saying all those things completely with all facial expressions that go with it. So while currently you might sometimes be surprised by the speeches world leaders give, you can imagine that this is going to go up quite rapidly if anyone can create a video of any world leader saying basically anything. And we will need to find ways, both technical and more societal, to deal with these kind of problems. I hope this was a bit of helpful background information compared to all the other stories we've talked about these 2 days. And time for questions.
I have a question about fact-checking. Mm-hmm. What do you think about fact-checking? Is it a good tool to counteract fake news and disinformation online? Thank you.
Well, if you do it as an organization, especially now with fake news, the issue is that the people who read the fake news stories don't necessarily will be the people you will target if you fact-check. Right? So if you as an organization fact-check, who then gets to read your update? That's kind of the biggest issue we've had with social media, because those fake news stories spread much quicker than the explanation of what actually happened. If you can fact check and you can do it, again, very concise, very clear, simple language that kind of helps understand people which parts were true, which parts weren't true, and what the actual truth is, I think that helps, but the difficulty will always be of getting that to people who've already seen the fake news stories.
So what do people do? I'm just going to give one example. Being an American, I've been rather obsessed with Mr. Trump and fake news and everything that's going on. And I'll go back to the period when Trump was running for president. And I think he got this idea, I might be wrong, from Roger Stone, who, by the way, I think is a real manipulator of fake news. He's a real specialist in this. People don't realize how influential he was in Trump's campaign. But whoever it was started the birther idea that President Obama didn't have was not born in Hawaii as an American citizen. So what do you do when people say, you say, well, that's not, someone says, you know, he wasn't born in, you know, he's not really an American. And we have his birth, they finally produced the birth certificate to show that he actually was indeed born in Hawaii and to an American mother. And then people say, well, yes, but the birth certificate was fraudulent.
Yeah.
Somebody faked birth certificate. So it gets you down these rabbit holes that I don't think anybody can get out of.
It's difficult. In that sense, I think a bit to conspiracy theories, which suffer from the same problem. I think the biggest issue with any of those is that what you should actually do, but it's almost impossible, is talk to those people first. What kind of evidence would you need to, you know, understand that you're wrong? Because what they usually do is they say, we want evidence that this happened. You give evidence, and because of confirmation bias or cognitive dissonance, all kinds of, you know, processes, they just refuse to accept it. I think in advanced state, what do you need? You can then have a discussion, okay, is that something we can produce? Is it a reasonable request? And then you can show it and then kind of say, well, you know, that's what we've agreed on. But you will find, especially with some groups that are very, have a very strong worldview, let's put it that way, they will not be influenced by anything. And I think you see it now with people who believe in the flat earth conspiracy, for example, as well, or people who say the moon, you know, no man has ever been on the moon. That is, if you would ask them what kind of information would you need to, you know, start thinking otherwise, they would always avoid the question, because once they do, then actually someone could refute them and could tell them they're wrong, and they want to avoid that at all costs.
Yep.
Just a couple of thoughts to share. I've found that as you were demonstrating the types of thinking and how to go from one phase, from the myths to fact and so forth, I was thinking that I personally, most of us probably here know two types of people: those who will stick to their original belief, and those who would just be completely gullible and not even think that any report should be taken with a grain of salt, and that would not show any skepticism. And I remember several such fakes, such concoctions that I have come in direct contact with. One was supposedly a speech given by Donald Trump in regards to some issues of Holocaust. I can't quite remember. I think it was supposed to be given at the National Holocaust Museum in Washington, and very simple research, just cutting and pasting several sentences from the speech brought me over to a website of a person who had written that speech as something that President Trump could have said, which he had never said. When I reported back to the people who sent me this supposedly original speech by Trump, they were completely in complete denial that this was. Well, this is the author of the speech, which was beautifully written, by the way, and very much apropos to all the issues, and also dealt with Holocaust denial and so forth. And yet the people who sent it to me, they just refused to believe it. And that's, of course, a complete, an impasse. It's a dead-end situation, and you just give up. Otherwise, you just spoil your relationship. But the same goes with the much larger issues of Holocaust denials, or genocide, or Armenian genocide denial in Turkey, or Holocaust denial practically everywhere in Europe and Russia and post-Soviet space. So how does one layperson like me deal with it? I mean, what resources do I have?
Yeah, so I've had, I think, a month at some point where I tried talking to people who have beliefs like that and see if I could make them see some sense. It's almost impossible. I think you've got a large group of people where, as you say, some are gullible, and the gullible people are usually a bit easier to change their thought process off because they aren't as invested in believing what they say is right. While there's kind of usually a hardcore group, right, at the core that goes so rigid in their thinking that they would not be open to any kind of refusal in any way. I would usually try, have a chat with them, see where they're coming from, and see if they can really reason their way out of it, because sometimes by asking just questions and by being showing a bit that you're just open to whatever they have to say, but you're kind of wondering where their thought process is coming from, you can sometimes in a subtle way point out to them where they are really making mistakes, but whatever they're saying is really not the case. And at times I can plant a seed where people start realizing a bit more what they're doing is probably not right, but it takes a long time, it's a lot of effort, and you will never get it done in one session in essence. In just one dinner conversation. That's not sadly not happening.
Any other questions? No? Okay, Tommy, thank you very much.